The punch landed with a sickening thud against the stranger's jaw. It echoed through the bustling airport terminal like a shot fired in the middle of a crowd. People froze, eyes wide with shock. No one had expected it. The air seemed to go still for a moment, all eyes on the man who was now staggering back from the force of the blow. His face twisted in confusion, disbelief, and pain. The punch had come from a uniformed officer, a cop in his mid-40s, with a face reddened from anger. The cop didn't seem to care about the shocked stares or the whispers growing louder around them. He stood there, chest heaving, eyes filled with rage. And yet, the man who had just been punched? He didn't even flinch. He looked back up at the cop with a calmness that made everything seem even more unreal. This wasn't any ordinary punch. This was a punch aimed at someone important, someone who had been mistaken for just another person. The man who had just been struck was Kim Jong-un, the leader of North Korea. No one in the airport had known who he was. No one had recognized him. The moment hung in the air. People were too afraid to speak, too afraid to move. A strange silence followed, broken only by the low murmur of confused voices. Would this end with the cop being arrested? Would the airport go into lockdown? Would anyone figure out who the man really was? Was the situation about to escalate into something much bigger? The cop didn't seem to care. He was still standing there, his hands shaking as he looked at the man who had just been struck. And Kim Jong-un? He was just standing there too, a slight frown forming on his face as he straightened himself up. The cop had no idea who he had just punched. But Kim Jong-un had a pretty good idea of what was about to happen next. It all started hours before, at the airport in Washington, D.C. There was no indication that anything unusual would happen that day. The terminal was as busy as usual, people rushing to their gates, families and friends saying goodbye, and travelers hurrying to make their flights. The buzz of conversation was constant, the sound of rolling suitcases and the beeping of security scans filling the background. On the outside, everything looked normal. But in the midst of it all, an unassuming figure walked through the crowd. A man in his early 40s, wearing a black suit and sunglasses, walking at a slow, deliberate pace. His posture was confident, but his eyes scanned the area, taking in every detail. He didn't look like someone who was used to standing out. In fact, he seemed just like any other businessman heading to a flight. What the people around him didn't know was that this man wasn't any ordinary traveler. This was Kim Jong-un, the dictator of North Korea, who had somehow found himself in Washington, D.C., in the middle of an undercover mission. He was there on a private trip, hoping to gather information and see for himself how the United States was shaping up under President Joe Biden's administration. His reasons for being there were unclear, even to those who were involved in the operation. There had been whispers of a possible meeting with government officials. Some believed that Kim Jong-un was secretly looking for opportunities to ease tensions between North Korea and the U.S. Others said he was scouting out weaknesses, trying to find ways to destabilize American influence in the region. Whatever his reason for being there, it was a carefully guarded secret. For most of the people in the airport, the presence of someone so high profile went unnoticed. Kim Jong-un didn't draw attention. He kept to himself, moving through the crowd with ease. His disguise was almost perfect. His bodyguards, dressed as civilians, stayed a few steps behind him, blending into the crowd as well. They were all trained professionals, experts at blending into their surroundings. They moved like shadows, invisible to everyone except for the few who knew who they really were. Kim Jong-un moved like a man on a mission, his face hard with determination as he approached the security check. The line was short, which made things easier. He placed his belongings on the conveyor belt, took off his shoes, and walked through the metal detector. Nothing seemed out of place, the usual routine for any traveler. No one looked twice at him. But then, just as he was about to move through the gate, disaster struck. The airport had recently hired a new security officer, Officer Mark Jensen. He was a man with a quick temper and an itchy trigger finger. It wasn't unusual for him to become irritable in the face of delays or difficult passengers. He had been in a bad mood all morning after receiving a minor reprimand from his superior. His shift had barely started, and he was already frustrated with the never-ending stream of passengers and the routine that felt like it was dragging on forever. When Kim Jong-un came through, Jensen didn't see a world leader. He didn't see a person of high importance. All he saw was an unfamiliar face, and something about that irritated him. Maybe it was the sunglasses, or the way the man was walking as if he were above everyone else. Maybe it was the way the man avoided looking at him directly, as if he had something to hide. Whatever it was, it triggered something in Officer Jensen. Without thinking, he stepped forward, blocking Kim Jong-un's path. "Excuse me," he said, his voice loud and firm. "You need to step aside for a moment." Kim Jong-un didn't respond immediately. He didn't speak English fluently, and he certainly didn't expect to be stopped at an airport for no apparent reason. But instead of complying, he paused. His bodyguard stood still behind him, watching closely. Jensen wasn't used to being ignored. He stepped forward again, raising his voice, feeling his frustration rising. "I said, step aside, now!" Kim Jong-un raised an eyebrow but said nothing. To him, this seemed like just another unimportant security officer doing his job. But to Jensen, it felt like a personal insult. "That's it," Jensen muttered under his breath. "You think you're above the law?" And that's when the punch came. Now, the terminal was alive with tension. The officer's anger was obvious. Kim Jong-un's calmness was unsettling, and for everyone around them, the uncertainty was growing by the second. Would the situation escalate? Would someone intervene? Or was it already too late to stop what was about to happen? The punch had struck so quickly, so unexpectedly, that it left a strange stillness in its wake. The air in the airport terminal seemed to freeze. People exchanged nervous glances, unsure of what to do, or even if they should do anything. Some had already pulled out their phones recording the scene, while others simply stared, rooted to the spot, waiting for the next move. Kim Jong-un, still standing, appeared almost unbothered by the blow. His sunglasses had been knocked askew, but he didn't immediately adjust them. Instead, he slowly wiped his lips with his hand, as if he had just been gently brushed by a gust of wind. His bodyguards, who had been blending into the crowd just moments ago, now moved forward with deliberate calmness. They were not reacting with the same shock or fear that others were. They had been trained for moments like this, prepared for situations that could spiral out of control. Officer Jensen, however, was not trained for a situation like this. His eyes widened for a fraction of a second as he realized what had just happened, what he had just done. But before he could process it further, one of Kim Jong-un's bodyguards stepped up, moving with the fluidity of a professional. He was already close enough to the cop to make him feel a twinge of panic. The bodyguard's eyes were cold and calculating. Jensen quickly backed away, his face flushing with a mix of anger and embarrassment. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not in public, not like this. "Back off, officer," the bodyguard said, his voice calm but firm, with a slight foreign accent. He gave Jensen a look that was more chilling than any threat could have been. Jensen wanted to argue, wanted to shout, but the words caught in his throat. He was out of his depth, and more than that, he had no idea who he had just punched. The man he had struck was still standing, barely even flinching. But something about his demeanor, the way he didn't seem shocked, didn't seem fazed, began to nag at the back of Jensen's mind. What if he had just punched someone important? Someone who had the power to make this entire situation blow up in his face? The thought made him sick to his stomach. Before he could dwell on it too long, the situation escalated in another direction. A loud voice came from the security office, followed by the rushed footsteps of several other officers. Jensen's supervisor, a tall, broad-shouldered man named Officer Matthews, had arrived on the scene, his face already tight with concern. "What's going on here?" Matthews barked, his gaze flicking between Jensen, the man who had been punched, and his bodyguards. Jensen stammered, rubbing the back of his neck nervously. He didn't listen to me, sir. I asked him to step aside, and when he didn't, The words trailed off as Matthews' eyes narrowed, locking onto Kim Jong-un for the first time. Something in the way the man was standing, his posture, his calm expression, and the aura of control he carried set off a tiny alarm bell in Matthews's mind. "Who is he?" Matthews asked, his voice suddenly quieter, but with an edge. The question hung in the air for a moment, unanswered. Jensen had no idea who this man was, and he realized that now might be a bad time to make a further fool of himself by admitting his ignorance. "Don't you recognize him?" the bodyguard replied coldly, not giving Jensen the chance to speak. "This is Kim Jong-un." The words seemed to hang in the air, almost unreal. Matthews blinked twice, the name registering in his brain. Kim Jong-un, the dictator of North Korea. The man who had been in the news for years, the man who controlled an entire country, whose decisions had caused international tension time and again. He had no idea why Kim Jong-un was here, but the realization hit Matthews like a punch to the gut. He had to act quickly. "Get the hell out of here, Jensen," Matthews snapped, his voice laced with panic. "You just punched the leader of North Korea. Do you understand the mess you've just made?" Jensen's stomach turned, the blood draining from his face. I didn't know, sir," he mumbled, now realizing the magnitude of his mistake. But there was no time to explain. Matthews was already pulling out his phone, typing furiously. As Matthews stepped away to make calls, Jensen remained frozen, standing just a few feet from the man he had struck, now realizing that his entire life could change in the span of a single mistake. Kim Jong-un stood there, silently observing everything, still too composed, too calm. The bodyguards were on high alert, eyes scanning the terminal. They knew the situation had gone from being an uncomfortable encounter to something much more dangerous. The world was about to find out that Kim Jong-un had been in the U.S., and that fact alone would have serious implications. Kim Jong-un wasn't a man who took insults lightly, especially not in a foreign country where he had no allies to back him up. His reputation was built on the foundation of fear and respect. He had made it this far in his career by ensuring that no one dared to cross him. And now, a foolish American cop had made the mistake of striking him in public. But Kim Jong-un was also a man who understood the importance of control. As much as he wanted to retaliate, as he wanted to show that he wouldn't tolerate this kind of disrespect, he also knew that this was a delicate situation. A public confrontation at an airport would only make things worse. There would be too many cameras, too many eyes. Instead, he stood his ground and did what he always did best: he waited. Behind the scenes, though, things were already moving quickly. Matthews had already contacted the higher-ups. Within minutes, the airport was on high alert. Security had been informed, and calls had gone out to law enforcement and even the U.S. government. The presence of a high-profile foreign leader in the country, especially one as controversial as Kim Jong-un, meant that the incident could spiral out of control quickly. They couldn't afford to let this become an international incident. Meanwhile, Jensen, still standing in the center of the terminal, like a deer caught in the headlights, was completely unaware of how quickly the news was spreading. By now, security had already been notified, and people were frantically trying to clear the area. Everyone in the airport seemed to sense that something big was happening, but no one really knew how deep it ran or how far it would go. The tension was palpable. And in the midst of it all, Kim Jong-un stood quietly, his thoughts already working on how he would handle the situation. He had been insulted, but this was far from over. As Jensen stood there, awaiting whatever consequences were to follow, a quiet realization began to settle in. He had made a massive mistake. But no one could have predicted how the world would react to the incident at that very moment. The phone calls and frantic movements in the background were only the beginning. The most dangerous part was still to come. The weight of the situation began to press down on Officer Mark Jensen with an intensity he had never experienced before. He stood in the middle of the terminal, his palms clammy, his heart racing. He hadn't meant for any of this to happen. It was supposed to be a routine check, a small misunderstanding. But now everything was spiraling out of his control. The noise in the airport had picked up again, but it was a nervous energy, a hum of tension, that everyone in the terminal could feel, but no one wanted to acknowledge. People were whispering in hushed tones, casting furtive glances toward Kim Jong-un and his bodyguards. The once casual crowd of travelers had now shifted into a group of onlookers, their curiosity piqued, but their discomfort palpable. Many of them had started filming on their phones, capturing what was unfolding in front of them, unsure of what was happening, but instinctively knowing that this was something important, something dangerous. Jensen couldn't move. He felt like he was stuck in place, trapped by the consequences of his rash decision. His supervisor, Officer Matthews, had stepped aside to make calls, but it didn't take long for the gravity of the situation to become clear. Within minutes, the airport's internal security team had been alerted, and the airport's leadership had called for heightened security protocols. Word was already out. The incident was no longer just a minor altercation between a cop and a man who refused to follow directions. It was a diplomatic nightmare. Kim Jong-un, who had initially seemed unfazed by the punch, now exuded an icy calm. His bodyguards, who had taken up positions around him, spoke in low, urgent voices. One of them, a tall man with a sharp face, was speaking on a secure phone. It was clear from his body language that he was taking no chances. The situation had escalated, and the next steps would be critical. They couldn't afford any more mistakes. Kim Jong-un's eyes flicked toward the gate, then back to Jensen, who was still standing there, like a man who had just realized the magnitude of the mess he'd created. The dictator hadn't moved much since the pun, "Shh," except to adjust his sunglasses and stare at the cop with a look of cold indifference. But it wasn't indifference. Not really. It was calculation. Kim Jong-un was a master at reading situations and, even more importantly, controlling them. He knew the power of his image. He knew how to use a moment of weakness to his advantage, and right now, he saw an opportunity. He slowly stepped forward, moving toward Jensen with deliberate steps, his gaze never leaving the cop. The bodyguards stood still, alert, their hands resting near their weapons, but making no moves to escalate the situation further. Kim Jong-un was in control. The bodyguards knew it. Jensen swallowed hard as Kim Jong-un closed the distance. The cop's body stiffened, and he braced himself for what might come next. Would he be arrested? Would the situation escalate even further? He had no idea how far this could go. What if the press got involved? What if they started asking questions? What if the whole thing blew up and became an international scandal? The last thing he wanted was to be the guy who punched a foreign leader in an airport. Kim Jong-un stopped just in front of him. His eyes, dark and calculating, met Jensen's. "You think you can do this to me?" Kim Jong-un asked quietly, his voice calm but edged with authority. The words hung between them like a weight. Jensen felt the tension in his chest tighten. He had no idea what to say. His mind raced for an answer, but all he could do was stand there, feeling small in the presence of this man-this world leader who had been the cause of so many international incidents. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean," Jensen stammered, his voice shaky. His apology felt weak, empty. He wasn't sure if Kim Jong-un would even care to hear it, but Kim Jong-un didn't respond immediately. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, his lips curling into a small, almost imperceptible smile. It wasn't a smile of kindness, but one of amusement, as if Jensen's words didn't even register. To Kim Jong-un, this was just a brief moment in a much large air game. He had dealt with worse. He had dealt with worse people. And in the grand scheme of things, this was just another problem to be solved. "You have no idea what you've just done," Kim Jong-un said, his voice colder now. "But you will." Jensen's heart sank further. He couldn't process what was happening. He had just punched a man who could bring an entire country to its knees if he wanted to. Before he could speak again, Matthews reappeared, his expression grim. He had finished making the necessary phone calls, and now he was here to clean up the mess. But what could he do? There was no easy way to fix this. Not now. Not with the leader of North Korea standing right in front of them. "I'm sorry, sir," Matthews said, stepping forward. "I'll take care of this. You don't need to worry." But Kim Jong-un wasn't listening. He turned his back on Matthews, dismissing him entirely, and addressed Jensen once again. "Take responsibility for this. You'll see what happens when you disrespect me." Jensen could barely keep himself upright. He didn't know what Kim Jong-un meant by that, whether it was a threat or some kind of warning. But one thing was for sure. He had just made the biggest mistake of his life. The situation was escalating, and the tension in the air was palpable. In a matter of minutes, what had been a routine security check had turned into a nightmare of global proportions. The security team had already begun evacuating the surrounding areas of the terminal, clearing out bystanders, and keeping everyone at a distance from Kim Jong-un and his entourage. A few phone calls to the White House had already been made, and military and government officials were now on high alert. The police were now under strict orders to contain the situation and prevent any further escalation. But there was an underlying fear that the situation had already gotten out of hand. What had started an unfortunate mistake, now had the potential to turn into an international crisis. Jensen was being pulled aside by his supervisor, Matthews, who was trying to defuse the situation as best as he could. But he could see the fear in Matthews' eyes, fear of the consequences, of what would happen if word of this reached the media. They couldn't afford to let this get out. Not yet. Not until they could figure out what to do with Kim Jong-un. But the world was already watching. The footage from the airport had spread like wildfire. It wouldn't be long before everyone knew what had happened. And once it was out there would be no turning back. The news spread like wildfire. By the time the first reports reached the outside world, the incident at Washington, D.C.'s International Airport had already begun to dominate the headlines. Within hours, it was all anyone could talk about. In offices, schools, homes, and on social media, the story of Officer Mark Jensen's punch, delivered to none other than Kim Jong-un, was plastered everywhere. The initial shock and disbelief from the passengers at the airport had quickly turned into confusion as they began to realize the gravity of the situation. The situation had been caught on multiple cameras, and soon the footage was everywhere. People were watching a man, seemingly a regular traveler, get punched by a police officer, and then discovering that the man was, in fact, the leader of one of the most secretive and dangerous countries in the world. At first, the news was met with incredulity. Who would believe such a thing? But as the days passed and more details emerged, the world began to grasp the magnitude of the mistake. The U.S. government had reacted immediately, calling an emergency meeting in the White House. The National Security Council was in a state of frenzy. Kim Jong-un's presence in the United States, even in an unofficial covert capacity, had been a well-kept secret. No one in the government had known about his visit until it was too late. Inside the airport, as the authorities scrambled to make sense of the mess, things had only gotten more complicated. The U.S. government was now facing a delicate situation with North Korea. No one could say for sure what Kim Jong-un's intentions were in coming to America, but one thing was certain. The punch had severely escalated tensions. No one knew if the leader of North Korea would view it as an unforgivable insult or an opportunity for leverage. At the airport, Officer Matthews was doing his best to manage the fallout, but nothing could stop the media storm that had erupted. Every reporter in the D.C. area had descended on the airport, and social media was ablaze with every possible theory and rumor. The questions were endless. Had Kim Jong-un come to negotiate with the U.S. government? Was this an assassination attempt? Why was he in Washington in the first place? And most importantly, how would Kim Jong-un respond? Meanwhile, Kim Jong-un's bodyguards had quietly and efficiently moved him away from the scene, guiding him to a private lounge area at the airport where they had been instructed to remain until further notice. They kept their presence low-key, but their eyes were always on alert. The group had been prepared for the worst, but even they were uncertain of how to handle a situation like this. Kim Jong-un, who had been calm throughout the incident, was now sitting in a plush chair, adjusting his sunglasses once again. His bodyguards were standing around him, giving him space to think. Though outwardly he appeared composed, inwardly Kim Jong-un was already calculating how to turn the incident to his advantage. "Contact our people in Pyongyang," he ordered coldly, his voice low. "I want them to prepare a statement. I want to control the narrative before it spins out of control." One of the bodyguards nodded quickly, pulling out a satellite phone. Kim Jong-un had already realized that this could either be a moment to gain international sympathy or a moment to escalate things further. He needed to decide how he wanted to frame the situation. One thing was for sure: he wouldn't let the world see him as weak, especially after being struck in public by an American cop. "Make sure we get the media's attention. If we have to use the international news networks to make our case, so be it," he added, his gaze narrowing. "I want a meeting with the U.S. ambassador, and I want it now." The bodyguard immediately went to work, sending messages to the North Korean embassy, while others began organizing the logistics of contacting the appropriate officials. Back in the airport terminal, things were becoming increasingly tense. As the media flooded the building, security scrambled to keep things from getting out of hand. Matthews and Jensen were pulled into a small room by the airport security chief, an older man named Richard Burke, who looked like he was about to implode from stress. "Jensen, what the hell were you thinking?" Burke demanded, his voice tight with frustration. "Do you have any idea what you've just done?" Jensen, still in a daze, stared at the floor. He hadn't even begun to process the consequences of his actions. "I didn't know who he was, sir," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "I thought he was just another guy trying to make trouble." Burke's hand shot up, silencing him. "That's not the point. You've just punched one of the most powerful men in the world. Whether you knew who he was or not doesn't matter. Do you understand how bad this could get?" Jensen nodded, but his stomach was churning. He couldn't shake the image of Kim Jong-un's cold, calculating eyes staring him down after the punch. It felt like a dream, but he knew it was real. He could already feel the pressure mounting, not just from the situation with Kim Jong-un, but from the weight of everything else that was coming his way. The fallout from this incident could ruin him. And he knew. WIT. Burke turned to Matthews, who had been standing silently. "Get him out of here," Burke snapped. "We'll deal with him later. Right now, we have bigger issues." Matthews nodded stiffly, still trying to keep his composure. "Understood, sir." In the chaos of the airport, amidst the media frenzy and the heightened security, another figure was watching from a distance. A man with short, neatly combed hair and a dark suit stood by the terminal window, staring out at the scene unfolding. His expression was unreadable. He had been contacted by the White House moments after the incident broke, and now he was observing the situation with the quiet understanding of someone who had seen it all before. This man was Daniel Cooper, a senior advisor to President Joe Biden. He was the go-between for high-level foreign negotiations, someone with years of experience managing sensitive situations. And this, what had just happened, was one of the most delicate situations he had ever been tasked with handling. He knew that this wasn't just about one reckless cop. This was about North Korea, about international diplomacy, and about how the U.S. would respond to Kim Jong-un's very public humiliation. Cooper's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, reading the text message from the National Security Council. "We need to prepare for an emergency meeting with North Korea's representatives. The situation is escalating. The president wants a response, fast." Cooper took a deep breath and stepped forward, leaving the room. It was time to get to work. The next 24 hours would determine the fate of this situation. He couldn't afford to let it slip out of control. As the day wore on, the news outlets were filled with updates on the incident. Global reactions ranged from disbelief to outrage. In South Korea, Japan, and China, there were already calls for explanations. How could this happen? Was it an accident or was it intentional? Governments around the world were already drafting responses, but no one had yet figured out how to handle the delicate matter of Kim Jong-un's visit. At the same time, Kim Jong-un was preparing for his next move. The U.S. had no idea what was coming. The air inside the private lounge at the airport was thick with tension. Kim Jong-un sat in a plush leather chair, his fingers steepled in front of him as he stared at the walls of the room, lost in thought. His bodyguards had taken their positions around him, their eyes scanning the room, constantly vigilant. Outside, the sound of bustling reporters and security personnel drifted in, but inside the room, there was an eerie silence. Kim Jong-un's mind was racing. The punch had been humiliating, but it was more than that. It was a mistake, a critical error on the part of the American authorities. The kind of mistake that could either make him appear weak or give him the upper hand in a negotiation. Kim Jong-un didn't just want power, he wanted respect. And the disrespect he had just suffered would not go unpunished. As he leaned back in the chair, he remembered his father's teachings. His father had always told him that diplomacy was about control. It wasn't about winning every battle. It was about positioning oneself in a way that forced others to do the winning for you. But his father also taught him that power, when it was tested, had to be shown. There were moments when you couldn't allow weakness to be perceived. His father had dealt with the United States before, had fought for North Korea's place on the world stage with threats and bluster. Kim Jong-un had learned the lessons of his father well. But now, it wasn't about flexing his muscles with nuclear tests or saber rattling. This was a different kind of war fought with public opinion, diplomacy, and timing. It wasn't long before the door to the lounge opened and one of his bodyguards entered. He was holding a phone, the screen glowing with the name of North Korea's ambassador to the United States. The ambassador had already been briefed about the situation and was waiting on the line to discuss how to handle the incident. Kim Jong-un gave a slight nod, signaling for the bodyguard to hand him the phone. "Yes," he said, his voice as calm as ever, though beneath the surface there was a simmering anger. "Supreme Leader," the ambassador's voice crackled through the phone. "We've been in contact with the U.S. government. They're in damage control mode right now. The White House has issued a statement expressing concern about the incident and calling it an unfortunate misunderstanding. But there is no apology. Not yet." Kim Jong-un's fingers tightened around the phone. "A misunderstanding?" he said coldly, his voice taking on an icy edge. "That man struck me in front of his country's citizens. There's no misunderstanding there. The U.S. is already playing their cards. They think they can smooth this over with weak words, but it won't be that easy." The ambassador hesitated before responding, as if weighing his words carefully. "Supreme Leader, the White House wants to avoid further escalation. They suggest a formal meeting between you and American officials to discuss this matter privately. They're worried about the optics, about how this might play out in the media." Kim Jong-un's lips curled into a thin smile. This was exactly what he wanted. The U.S. was already trying to control the damage, but he wasn't about to let them off the hook so easily. He would make them sweat, make them earn his cooperation. "Tell them," he said slowly, "that I will agree to a meeting, but only if they come to me. I want their highest-ranking officials here, on my terms, and I will not be disrespected again." The ambassador's voice was even more cautious now. "I will relay your message, Supreme Leader, but there is concern. This could escalate quickly. They may not want to come, given the circumstances." Kim Jong-un chuckled darkly, his gaze narrowing. "Then they will have a choice. They can either come and face me as equals, or they can face the consequences of their cowardice. But I will not stand for this insult. Make sure they understand that." After a brief silence, the ambassador replied, "Understood, Supreme Leader. I will send the message right away." Kim Jong-un hung up the phone without another word, his face expressionless, but his thoughts already moving ahead. The U.S. had no idea what they had just stepped into. They thought they could contain this incident with polite diplomacy, but they didn't understand him or the extent to which he would go to make sure that this wasn't swept under the rug. Meanwhile, in Washington, the situation was rapidly becoming a nightmare for the White House. The president had been briefed multiple times throughout the day, and advisors were scrambling to prepare a response that would calm the storm without backing down too much. The U.S. was in a delicate position. The incident was not just about one officer's poor decision. It was about U.S.-North Korea relations, already fragile at the best of times. Now, it seemed as though the delicate balance of diplomacy had been shattered with one punch. Daniel Cooper, the senior advisor, was in a meeting with the National Security Council when the call came in from the North Korean embassy. He listened intently as the message was relayed. Kim Jong-un was demanding a private meeting on his terms. The U.S. could either send officials to meet with him or risk an even worse diplomatic fallout. Cooper was no stranger to high-stakes diplomacy, but this situation was different. The last thing the U.S. government needed was a North Korean crisis on top of everything else they were already managing. The global press was already making headlines out of the incident, and the media was on a frenzy. The American public wanted answers, and the international community was watching closely. There was no room for error. The entire situation could spiral out of control faster than anyone imagined. President Biden's voice crackled over the speakerphone. "What's the latest, Cooper?" Cooper rubbed his forehead. "It's not good, Mr. President. Kim Jong-un is demanding a meeting, but it's not just a regular diplomatic discussion. He's playing hardball, trying to make a public spectacle of it. He's framing it as a matter of respect. If we don't meet his conditions, he'll make this a major international incident." There was a brief pause before the president responded. "What are our options?" Cooper glanced at the other members of the National Security Council, who were all silently waiting for his input. "We have two choices, Mr. President. We can send a high-ranking official, maybe Secretary of State Blinken, to negotiate face-to-face with Kim Jong-un. But that comes with its risks. The other option is to refuse and risk Kim Jong-un escalating the situation in ways we can't control. If he goes public with this, it could spark chaos." Biden exhaled sharply. "We can't back down from this. We can't afford to let him walk all over us. But we also can't afford an international crisis. Set up the meeting. But we need to have a solid plan before anyone steps foot in that room." Cooper nodded. "Understood, sir. Well, make the arrangements." Back at the airport, Jensen sat in a small holding room, his head buried in his hands. His whole world had turned upside down in the span of a few hours. He couldn't stop thinking about the punch, about how he had acted so rashly. He had never imagined that such a simple mistake could trigger a chain reaction that would lead to international ramifications. Officer Matthews was standing nearby, pacing back and forth, talking on his phone with his superiors. Jensen tried to focus, but his mind kept drifting. He couldn't shake the image of Kim Jong-un's cold stare or the way the bodyguards had moved with such precision. It was all starting to feel like a nightmare. Finally, Matthews hung up the phone and turned to Jensen, his expression grim. "Listen, Jensen, we're in deep. The White House is involved now. You've got to understand, this isn't just about you anymore. This is a full-blown diplomatic situation. There are people much higher up than us who are going to take over from here." Jensen swallowed hard. "What happens to me?" Matthews hesitated. "That's the least of your worries right now. We've got to get through the next few hours without making things worse. Just stay quiet for now. Let the government handle it." But Jensen wasn't sure how much longer he could stay quiet. He had no idea how this was going to end, or if he'd even have a job after all of this. All he knew was that one bad decision had set in motion a series of events no one could have predicted. The hours stretched into a blur. As the night deepened, the tension in Washington, D.C. seemed to grow thicker, suffocating anyone who tried to navigate the complicated web of diplomatic conversations and media frenzy. By the time dawn broke, an emergency meeting had been set. It was being held in a secure conference room in the White House, but no one was sure if it would bring any resolution to the spiraling mess. Daniel Cooper was seated at the table, reviewing the latest intel on the situation with Kim Jong-un. The White House was still grappling with the aftermath of the punch, and with every passing minute, the pressure intensified. The U.S. government had just learned that Kim Jong-un was preparing a public statement, one that would likely accuse America of disrespecting its leader and causing an international incident. The thought of a major public backlash already seemed inevitable. President Biden, Secretary of State Blinken, and several high-ranking military advisors sat around the table. They were joined by Cooper and a handful of national security staff. Everyone was waiting for the next move, but no one had a clear answer. "The clock is ticking," Blinken said, his voice heavy with frustration. We can't allow Kim Jong-un to dictate the terms of this meeting. We need to control the narrative. I agree, Cooper said, tapping his pen against the conference table. But if we come across as dismissive or too stubborn, we risk escalating things further. Kim is not someone who likes to be ignored. We can't just play this down. He'll find a way to make it worse. Let's be clear. President Biden interjected, his voice firm. We're not going to let him use this incident as leverage. This isn't about one punch anymore. This is about protecting our credibility on the world stage. If we bow to his demands now, we send the wrong message. There was a brief silence in the room as everyone considered his words. No one wanted to escalate the situation further, but everyone also understood the high stakes. Any move now could send the wrong message to both Kim Jong-un and the rest of the world. Cooper leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. What if we offer him a concession, but one on our terms? A meeting, yes. But we choose the location. We insist on a neutral setting somewhere that allows us to maintain control. If we go to him, it sends a message of weakness. Biden raised an eyebrow. And where would that be? Cooper thought for a moment. Switzerland, neutral ground, internationally respected. We have back-channel contacts there. We can control the situation, keep it out of the media for now. This has to be done behind closed doors. Secretary Blinken nodded. That could work. It's neutral. It's secure. And it shows that we're willing to talk, but on our terms. Biden leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers together as he mulled it over. All right, get the ball rolling on this, but make it clear to Kim Jong-un that we won't be intimidated. Meanwhile, in the private lounge at the airport, the hours passed slowly for Kim Jong-un and his entourage. The news had already begun circulating that the U.S. was preparing a response, but the details were still unclear. For Kim, the waiting was the hardest part. He had already made his demands, but he knew that the Americans would hesitate. They always did. They liked to pretend that they were in control, that they were the ones calling the shots. But Kim Jong-un knew better. He had already told his bodyguards to prepare for the worst. If the Americans didn't meet his terms, he would make sure that they paid for it, whether through public humiliation, economic pressure, or worse. Kim Jong-un had learned to play the long game, and today he was playing it with deadly precision. His phone buzzed on the table, interrupting his thoughts. It was a message from his ambassador in Washington, D.C. The Americans were ready to negotiate, but they had one condition. The meeting would take place in Switzerland, not on U.S. soil. Kim Jong-un read the message twice, his expression unreadable, a neutral location. It was an interesting choice. He had expected them to try to contain the situation by keeping it on their turf. But by offering Switzerland, they were signaling a willingness to negotiate. It was a small but significant gesture. It wasn't enough to make him back down, but it was a step in the right direction. Kim Jong-un put the phone down and turned to his bodyguards. Prepare to leave for Switzerland. I want to make sure the Americans know I mean business. Back in Washington, as plans were set in motion for the meeting in Switzerland, Officer Mark Jensen was still holed up in a small holding room at the airport. He hadn't heard much about the developments since the incident, but he could tell from the way people were moving in and out of the room that things were getting worse. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was caught in something far bigger than he could have imagined. His mind raced. How had this all happened? How had a routine security check escalated into an international incident? Jensen had been trying to avoid the media's attention, but even in the small holding room, he could hear the buzz of reporters just outside the door. The entire airport was on lockdown, with security trying to keep journalists from getting too close to the high-profile visitors. But despite the attempts to control the narrative, Jensen knew that it was only a matter of time before he was thrust into the spotlight. As he sat there, a young officer entered the room holding a folder. His face was tense, and he moved quickly, clearly with important information. "Jensen," the officer said, "there's word from up top. You're being reassigned, effective immediately." Jensen looked up in confusion. "Reassigned? To where?" The officer hesitated. "They're not saying yet, but There's a possibility you'll be part of the security team for the upcoming negotiations in Switzerland. The higher-ups think it's best to keep a low profile for now. You're not going to be in the public eye, but Jensen's stomach churned. Wait, I'm going to Switzerland? After what happened? The officer nodded, though it didn't seem like he had much more information. You'll be briefed when you get there. Just pack your things. You're leaving tonight. The scene was set for the next phase of the crisis, an international summit in Switzerland. The leaders of North Korea and the United States would meet in the hopes of de-escalating a situation that was already spiraling out of control. But what neither side knew was how quickly things could spiral further. Jensen had no idea what he was getting into. He had no idea that he was about to be swept up into a political storm far bigger than any he had ever imagined. The next few days would change everything, both for him and for the world. As the flight to Switzerland took off, Jensen could only stare out the window, feeling the weight of everything that had led to this moment. The flight to Switzerland was a long, uneasy one for Mark Jensen. He couldn't stop thinking about the events of the past few days, the confusion, the disbelief, and the constant pressure mounting on him from all sides. What had begun as a simple altercation at an airport had now evolved into a geopolitical nightmare. He felt like a pawn in a game much larger than himself, one with stakes that he couldn't begin to comprehend. And now, the powers that be had decided that he was to play a role in what was to come next. Jensen had barely been given any details. He had been told that he was being reassigned, but hadn't been briefed on exactly what his new role would entail. All he knew was that, after the incident, he was not to make contact with anyone outside of the operation. He was to stay out of the media's reach and keep his head down. The pressure was suffocating, but he had little choice but to comply. As the plane made its descent into Geneva, Switzerland, Jensen peered out the window, his mind racing. The crisp, snow-capped mountains of the Swiss Alps came into view, casting a serene, almost surreal backdrop to the chaos that awaited on the ground. It was a stark contrast to the tension he could feel in the pit of his stomach. The plane landed in the early morning, and Jensen was quickly whisked away through the VIP terminal, avoiding the public eye. A government official, a man named Richard Thornton, met him at the tarmac. Thornton was tall and dressed in a dark suit, his face etched with the seriousness of the situation. "Officer Jensen," Thornton greeted him, his voice low. "I know you've been through a lot, but I need you to focus. This isn't just about you anymore. It's about protecting the interests of the United States." Jensen nodded, though the words felt hollow. He was still trying to understand how this had all spiraled out of control. But he couldn't waste time questioning it. The situation was too urgent. "We have your accommodations arranged," Thornton continued. "You'll be staying at a secure location, and you're not to leave the premises without authorization. We've put together a team to monitor and protect the perimeter. It's a tight operation." Jensen followed Thornton through a series of corridors and into a discreet black SUV. The ride to the Swiss government's secure compound, a secluded estate nestled just outside Geneva, was short but tense. Jensen glanced around, noticing the heavy security presence surrounding the area. The meeting was going to happen soon, but no one knew exactly where. The location remained under wraps, and security was tight. As soon as they arrived, Jensen was briefed on the situation. He would be part of a small security detail assigned to protect the U.S. delegation during the upcoming talks with North Korea. The U.S. was meeting Kim Jong-un's representatives the following day at a neutral location outside the city. But Jensen was told not to get too comfortable. The situation was volatile, and one wrong move could tip the balance. Inside the compound, the mood was grim. The U.S. team was doing everything they could to control the narrative and manage the fallout from the airport incident. President Biden's administration had taken heat from both domestic and international sources. Allies were questioning the strength of U.S. leadership, while adversaries saw an opportunity to exploit the weakness. North Korea's behavior, especially after the incident, was unpredictable at best. No one knew what Kim Jong-un truly wanted or how far he was willing to go. Jensen was introduced to his fellow team members, most of whom were seasoned security agents with extensive experience in high-stakes environments. Their faces were grim, and their eyes held a steely focus as they discussed the potential risks. But as Jensen was shown to his assigned quarters, he couldn't help but feel a sense of isolation. He was a cop from Washington, D.C., not a seasoned diplomat or security expert. He felt out of his depth. That night, as Jensen lay in bed staring at the ceiling, he tried to piece together the events that had led him here. He couldn't help but feel a surge of guilt. It had been his punch that set everything in motion, and now he was here, in Switzerland, thousands of miles away from home, because of one terrible mistake. Back in Geneva, Kim Jong-un's plane had already landed. His security team, as efficient and quiet as ever, escorted him to a private, undisclosed location. There, he would wait for the next day's meeting, the one that would determine the course of this crisis. Kim Jong-un had spent the evening preparing his statement, the one that he would deliver to the U.S. delegation. He knew that the Americans were already scrambling to avoid a full-scale diplomatic disaster. His own people had already begun crafting their narrative, portraying the punch as an unprovoked attack. It was an insult, they argued, to North Korea's dignity, and the world needed to know it. But Kim Jong-un was already planning his next move. He had to make sure that this meeting, whenever it happened, would play into his hands. If the Americans thought they could negotiate with him out of kindness or politeness, they were gravely mistaken. As he sat in his private room, surrounded by his most trusted advisors, he sent a message to the North Korean embassy in Geneva. Make sure the Americans know that I am not interested in empty apologies. I want respect. If they want to talk, they come to me with the right attitude. He smiled, a cold smile that barely touched his eyes. This wasn't just a diplomatic negotiation. It was a test of America's strength, its resolve. And Kim Jong-un intended to win. The following day, the U.S. delegation arrived at the undisclosed meeting site in a yet rural area outside of Geneva. The location was pristine and peaceful, surrounded by tall trees and fields of grass. It looked almost idyllic, a far cry from the political storm brewing just beneath the surface. The meeting had been set in a private mansion, one with secure entry points and thick stone walls. Jensen, who had been briefed on the situation the night before, stood at the edge of the estate grounds, trying to steady his nerves. His team had been deployed in full force to secure the perimeter, but there was something different about today. He couldn't shake the feeling that things weren't going to go smoothly. The air felt heavy, charged with tension, and his instincts told him that trouble was coming. Inside the mansion, the U.S. and North Korean delegations were seated in separate rooms, their representatives preparing for what was being called a preliminary discussion. The goal was simple: lay out the framework for the talks and establish ground rules. The real negotiations would come later, but what no one realized was that Kim Jong-un had already made up his mind. As Jensen and the other agents stood guard outside, he watched as the members of both delegations entered the building. His eyes locked onto one of the North Korean representatives, a man with a cold expression and an air of quiet authority. Jensen didn't know who he was, but he could feel the tension emanating from him. There was something about this man that made Jensen uneasy. Minutes later, a message came through the radio. Jensen's heart skipped a beat as the voice on the other end spoke. We have an unexpected situation. The North Koreans are demanding a private audience with Kim Jong-un immediately. The U.S. delegation is not included. Jensen froze. This was it, the moment everything could fall apart. He quickly relayed the information to his superior, but his thoughts were already die-racing. What did this mean? Why was North Korea suddenly making such a move? And more importantly, what would happen if the Americans refused? Would the summit collapse before it even truly began? Jensen stood at the edge of the mansion grounds, watching as the two delegations met in secret. The atmosphere was now a powder keg, and it was only a matter of time before someone lit the fuse. The sudden shift in the schedule sent ripples of unease through the U.S. delegation. The request for a private audience with Kim Jong-un had been unexpected, and its implications were far from clear. Inside the mansion, the air had thickened with tension as the North Korean representatives made their demands, and the Americans huddled in their own meeting room, exchanging wary glances. Jensen stood just outside the mansion, alongside his team, in the cold gray morning light. His mind was racing. The radio call had thrown everything off balance. The North Koreans were insisting on a private meeting with Kim Jong-un, excluding the U.S. delegation from the discussion. No one had given a clear reason for the sudden change, but it was clear that something was going on behind the scenes. The whole operation felt fragile now, as if one wrong move could shatter the fragile peace that had been painstakingly negotiated. Inside, the American delegation was in turmoil. "This is completely unacceptable," said Richard Thornton, the U.S. representative in charge of security. His voice was sharp, cutting through the thick tension in the room. "We agreed to meet under specific conditions, and now they're changing the rules at the last minute?" Secretary of State Blinken stood by the large conference table, his hands pressed together. His face was tight with frustration. This is classic Kim Jong-un. He's trying to assert dominance. This is his way of testing our resolve. We cannot let him dictate the terms of these talks. We came here to engage in diplomacy, not to be sidelined. "But we don't know what's going on in there," Cooper, though a senior advisor, added, his voice low. "What if Kim Jong-un is preparing some kind of stunt? A public spectacle? We can't just ignore it." The tension in the room was palpable. Blinken ran a hand through his hair, pacing. "We need to keep our composure. We don't make decisions based on fear. Let's give it an hour. If they don't open the doors to the full meeting by then, we walk." As he spoke, one of the aides entered, her face grim. "Sir, the North Koreans are requesting a press statement. They're going to announce that the Americans are refusing to engage in negotiations unless they're allowed to meet first." Cooper swore under his breath. "They're already playing us. They're trying to frame us as the obstructionists. That's exactly what we can't let happen." Minutes later, a message arrived from the North Korean delegation. "We will not proceed without a private meeting with the supreme leader. Your refusal to engage with us on our terms will be seen as a diplomatic affront." The message was clear. Kim Jong-un was playing a dangerous game, and the U.S. was caught in the crossfire. Outside, Jensen could feel the gravity of the situation weighing on him. He had been told to remain at the perimeter, to stay in contact with headquarters, and to make sure no one crossed the security lines. But as the minutes dragged on, his mind kept racing back to the message he had heard earlier on the radio. The North Koreans are demanding a private audience. The words felt like a warning, a harbinger of something worse. The ground around the mansion was quiet, save for the occasional footsteps of the security team stationed at every exit. Jensen stood at his post, trying to keep his focus on the task at hand, but his thoughts were scattered. He couldn't shake the feeling that things were teetering on the edge. They had been so close to the talks, starting so close to resolving this diplomatic disaster, and now everything seemed to be slipping away. As he glanced toward the mansion's entrance, the tension was palpable. He couldn't see much from where he stood, but the shadows moving through the windows told him that something was happening inside. The North Koreans were negotiating with the Americans, or rather, attempting to renegotiate the terms of the entire summit. At that moment, a movement at the corner of his vision caught his eye. One of the North Korean bodyguards had appeared on the balcony, his gaze scanning the area. Jensen felt his heart skip a beat. For a moment, their eyes met, and the guard's cold, unreadable expression sent a chill down Jensen's spine. He quickly turned his attention back to his post, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling. It was too late. The calm before the storm was about to break. Inside the mansion, Blinken's patience had worn thin. It had been over an hour since the North Korean delegation had insisted on the private meeting with Kim Jong-un, and still, there was no sign of movement. He knew they were on the brink of a public fallout. His phone buzzed on the table. Another message from the North Koreans. This time, it wasn't a request, it was an ultimatum. If the Americans do not comply within the hour, the talks will be considered null and void. We will return to North Korea. We can't let them walk away from this, Blinken said, his voice firm. We're here for peace talks, not for a public standoff. Cooper glanced up. We don't have much choice. If we give in to this now, we risk sending the message that we're weak. We can't be seen as backing down from a bully. Thornton, who had been monitoring the situation with the security team, spoke up. The North Koreans have made it clear they're prepared to escalate. We're getting word from the embassy. Kim Jong-un is threatening to leave if we don't comply. There's no way we can let him walk away with the upper hand. The room fell silent as everyone weighed the options. There were no good choices, but they were running out of time. The press outside was beginning to stir, and soon, the whole world would know if these talks were a failure or a success. Finally, Blinken stood up. Well, proceed. Let's give them what they want, but we need to move fast. All go into that private meeting. We won't let them frame this as a retreat. The decision had been made, but it came with consequences. As the delegation prepared to move into the private meeting with the North Koreans, Jensen received new orders. His team would remain outside, but the situation was escalating quickly. His job was to monitor the perimeter and be ready for anything. As he checked his equipment, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was no longer just a diplomatic mission. It was becoming a standoff between two world powers, and the stakes were higher than ever. Jensen's thoughts were interrupted when he noticed movement at the far end of the estate. Several North Korean diplomats were walking toward a side entrance, flanked by their bodyguards. He immediately keyed his radio, relaying the sighting to the security team, but before he could make another move, a low rumble shook the ground beneath him. For a split second, Jensen thought it was just the sound of a distant vehicle, but then the rumble intensified, and the ground seemed to vibrate more strongly. Suddenly, the mansion's front gate erupted in a series of sharp cracks. It sounded like gunfire. Jensen's heart slammed against his ribs as he sprinted toward the entrance. What the hell was happening? Had the North Koreans just launched an attack? Were they trying to force their way inside? The situation had just gone from tense to completely chaotic in a split second. He reached the front gate just as the sounds of shouting and commotion came from within the mansion. The North Korean delegation had stormed the building, and a moment of intense panic ensued. The guards at the front began scrambling, trying to maintain control as the American team was forced to respond. The perimeter that Jensen had been ordered to secure was now under direct threat. He glanced at his team members, knowing what they had to do next. This isn't just a negotiation anymore, Jensen muttered to himself, feeling a knot tighten in his stomach. The game had changed, and he was no longer just a spectator. The negotiations were on the brink of collapse, but as Jensen turned to face the chaos erupting before him, he knew the stakes had just been raised, big time. The question was just how the summit would end anymore. It was how far this was all going to go. The shock of the gunfire still echoed in Mark Jensen's ears. His heart was pounding as he crouched behind a low stone wall, trying to catch his breath. He could feel the adrenaline rushing through him, his body responding on instinct. He didn't know what had triggered the chaos inside the mansion. But he knew one thing. This was no longer a negotiation. This was an assault. The scene around him had gone from calm to chaos in a matter of seconds. The North Korean bodyguards had surged toward the main building with alarming speed, and the American security team scrambled to respond. Jensen's team had been stationed outside as a precaution, but now they were in the middle of a full-blown security breach. The perimeter was breached, and the mansion had been compromised. Jensen's mind raced. This was happening far faster than anyone could have prepared for. The security team had set up barriers around the mansion, but those could only do so much. The North Koreans weren't just playing the diplomatic game anymore, they were taking control. What started as a private negotiation was now evolving into something far more dangerous. "Jensen," a voice called from behind him. It was Thornton, the U.S. security chief. He was running toward him, his face drawn tight with urgency. "We need to regroup. The ambassador's office is Dare direct threat. Get to the main entrance, now." Without thinking, Jensen sprinted toward the entrance of the mansion, his boots pounding on the gravel. He could see North Korean soldiers moving quickly, their faces cold and unreadable. The shouting inside had grown louder, and the urgency in the air was palpable. Something had gone terribly wrong inside that mansion, and it was escalating beyond anything the U.S. team had been prepared for. As Jensen moved toward the building, a small explosion erupted just beyond the perimeter of the estate, sending a shockwave through the air. The blast knocked him off his feet, and for a moment, everything went silent. His vision blurred, and he could taste the acrid burn of smoke in the air. He shook his head, trying to clear the fog, and pushed himself up, stumbling toward cover. Jensen! Thornton's voice was strained. Jensen finally made it to the security team's position, where Thornton and a few other agents were coordinating their next steps. "We've got eyes on the ambassador's office, but it's being stormed. The North Koreans are trying to get access to the U.S. delegation's private communications." Jensen's stomach twisted. If the North Koreans got their hands on that kind of intel, it could change everything. The private messages, the plans for future talks, the strategies. The U.S. delegation couldn't afford that kind of vulnerability. "They can't get to that office," Jensen said, his voice steely with resolve. He knew what had to be done. The security perimeter needed to be reestablished, and fast. Thornton nodded grimly. "We need to lock down every entrance and keep them out. We've got snipers in place, but if we don't act now, they'll have full control of the mansion." Inside the mansion, things were rapidly unraveling. The atmosphere was thick with tension as the North Korean delegation stormed through the hallways, pushing past the U.S. security team. Kim Jong-un's private bodyguards, trained for situations like this, had quickly taken control, and they were moving with military precision. The U.S. team had been caught off guard. They were trained for many things: terrorist threats, diplomatic crises, even armed standoffs. But this was different. The North Koreans weren't just pushing for better terms. They were taking what they wanted by force. In the ambassador's office, Blinken and the U.S. delegation were huddled, trying to make sense of the chaos. The walls seemed to shake with the sound of heavy footsteps and the muffled thuds of weapons being drawn. They could hear the North Korean guards outside, demanding access. Blinken clenched his fists, trying to stay calm. "This is it," Blinken said quietly. "They've pushed us to the brink. We can't let them get what they want." President Biden's national security advisor, a man named Harris, stood near the window, peering out at the growing tension outside. "They're starting to breach the perimeter," he said, his voice grim. "The agents outside are holding their ground, but if we don't get out of here soon, we'll be trapped." Blinken knew that the clock was ticking. Every moment spent inside this office was another moment the North Koreans gained ground. The situation was deteriorating fast, and the idea of sitting at the table to negotiate now seemed almost laughable. There was no negotiation happening here. This was a standoff that could tip the balance into full-blown violence. "We need to go now," Blinken said, moving toward the door. He looked to his team, eyes hard with resolve. "We're not letting them control this room. Get to the backup vehicles, now." Jensen had made it to the main entrance of the mansion, just as Thornton had instructed. His team was quickly setting up a blockade to contain the situation. Jensen could hear the faint sounds of gunfire in the distance, but he stayed focused. His job wasn't to fight the North Koreans off single-handedly. It was to ensure the safety of the U.S. team and maintain order. He crouched low, scanning the area for any movement. The front entrance was still under heavy guard, but Jensen could see figures moving in the shadows, just outside the range of their security lights. North Korean bodyguards. They were closing in, no doubt with orders to either capture or neutralize anyone standing in their way. Jensen grabbed his radio. "Thornton, we've got a breach on the west side. They're pushing in from the far wall. We need backup fast." The voice on the other end crackled. "Understood. Just hold tight. Reinforcements are on the way." Jensen wasn't sure how long they could hold out. Every minute felt like an eternity. The whole operation was spiraling. If the U.S. team couldn't get a handle on the situation soon, it could lead to an international catastrophe. It was no longer about diplomacy or negotiations. This was a full-blown crisis. Suddenly, a voice shouted from behind him, snapping him back to reality. "Jensen, look out!" Before he could react, the door to the mansion flew open and several North Korean soldiers rushed toward him, weapons raised. Jensen's heart skipped a beat, adrenaline flooding his system. He wasn't prepared for this kind of direct confrontation, but he'd been trained to react quickly in high-pressure situations. He ducked behind a nearby pillar as the soldiers fired, narrowly avoiding the bullets that pinged off the stone walls around him. He could hear the commands being shouted in Korean, but he didn't have time to process them. The only thing that mattered was staying alive and protecting the U.S. delegation. With his mind working faster than his body could move, Jensen popped up from behind the pillar and returned fire. He was trying to buy time for the team inside the mansion to get out, but it was clear that he couldn't do this alone. He needed help. "Thornton, where's the backup?" Jensen shouted into the radio.
"We're 10 minutes out," came the reply. But Jensen knew that 10 minutes might be too long. The situation was deteriorating fast.
Inside the mansion, the North Koreans were beginning to overrun the building. The U.S. delegation was now trapped in a hallway, with no way out. Kim Jong-un's guards had stormed the floors, and the U.S. security team was fighting a losing battle. As Jensen continued to fire and retreat into the shadows, he realized something that sent a chill down his spine. If the North Koreans gained control of the mansion completely, this wouldn't just be a diplomatic failure. It would be a diplomatic disaster, a humiliation that the U.S. could not afford. Jensen took a deep breath and steadied his weapon. He couldn't afford to hesitate anymore. This wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about stopping a crisis before it escalated any further. But as he looked around, he knew that what was about to unfold would change everything. And there was no going back. Jensen's heart raced, his breath shallow as he ducked behind the stone pillar for cover. The North Korean soldiers were closing in, their footsteps growing louder with each passing second. Every moment felt like a countdown, each one bringing the U.S. delegation closer to being trapped inside the mansion, surrounded on all sides. The gunfire had become a constant rhythmic thunderclap in the distance, mingling with the screams and shouts that echoed through the halls. Through the crack in the door to the mansion, Jensen could see figures moving quickly, more North Korean guards pouring in. The mansion, once a place for high-level diplomacy, had now become a battleground. Jensen gritted his teeth, trying to calm his rapidly escalating panic. He wasn't alone. Thornton and a few other security agents had found their way to the same pillar for cover, their rifles aimed at the doorway, waiting for the next movement. "We need to get to the backup vehicles," Thornton muttered, his voice taut with tension. "Now, before they lock this the place down." Jensen nodded grimly, his mind already calculating the fastest way to get out of the line of fire. He checked his weapon, making sure it was fully loaded, his movements quick and silent. The situation had gone beyond anything they could have prepared for. There was no diplomatic solution now, no last-minute save. The North Koreans weren't looking for negotiations anymore. They wanted control. Without warning, a grenade exploded nearby, sending Jensen crashing to the ground as debris rained down. His head slammed against the stone floor, and for a moment, everything went dark. His ears were ringing. Blood dripped from a gash on his forehead, but the pain was nothing compared to the crushing weight of realization. This was no longer a standoff, it was war. Jensen forced himself to his feet, his vision swimming. Thornton was shouting at him from across the courtyard, his face barely visible through the dust. The grenade had thrown him off balance, but it had also given the North Koreans the opening they needed. More soldiers were pouring in from every side. There was no way out unless they made a run for it, and even then, the odds weren't in their favor. "Move, Jensen, now!" Thornton barked. Jensen didn't wait for a second command. He sprinted for the entrance, taking cover behind a large oak tree as bullets zipped past him. The ground shook again, this time from the sound of military vehicles approaching. His heart skipped a beat. Reinforcements? Or was it the North Koreans bringing in more firepower? The sound of heavy engines grew louder, and Jensen dared a glance around the tree. His eyes widened in horror. North Korean tanks were rolling toward the mansion's perimeter. "This is bad," Jensen muttered, his voice barely audible over the cacophony of war. Tanks on the ground, soldiers swarming in from every direction. The U.S. team was being pushed back. Asked. Inside the mansion, the situation was just as dire. Blinken and the U.S. delegation were holed up in a room on the second floor, barricading the door as best as they could. They had managed to get to the backup office just in time, but they couldn't stay there for long. The North Korean soldiers were closing in, and their patience was wearing thin. "Sir," an aide called urgently, "the backup vehicles are too far. We won't make it through with this many soldiers outside." Blinken's eyes flickered to the window, where he could see the movement of North Korean soldiers securing the area, setting up positions around the mansion. The entire estate was quickly becoming a fortress of foreign soldiers, each one marching toward the U.S. delegation like a predator closing in on its prey. "We need to make it to the underground bunker," Blinken said, his voice low but steady. "We'll move fast, and we move together. No one gets left behind." There wasn't time for hesitation. The bunker was their last chance. But getting there without being caught by the soldiers patrolling the grounds? That was a different story. Every part of Blinken's brain screamed for a better plan, but the reality was unforgiving. There was no easy exit. If they wanted to survive this, they had to get out of the mansion, and they had to do it now. Jensen had made it to the far side of the mansion grounds, the sound of tanks and gunfire closing in behind him. His team was scattered, trying to make their way toward the backup vehicles hidden at the edge of the estate. He could see one of the armored cars just ahead, but getting there wouldn't be easy. The North Koreans had positioned snipers in every strategic location, and it seemed like every corner was under surveillance. He gripped his rifle tighter and sprinted for the nearest cover, hoping that he could make it. The thought of getting caught, of being surrounded by North Korean forces, was unbearable. He couldn't let that happen, not after everything they'd been through. His radio crackled to life. It was Thornton. "Jensen, we've got heavy. I fire on the east side. We're pinned down. Move fast. There's a small breach in the perimeter just up ahead." Jensen didn't hesitate. He took a sharp left, pushing through a cluster of trees that provided some cover from the incoming fire. The mansion loomed behind him, a towering symbol of what had been an ambitious diplomatic effort now reduced to chaos. He could hear the clanking of the tanks in the distance, the sound growing louder as they drew closer. He was running out of time. Just as he was about to round a corner, he heard a familiar voice shout his name. "Jensen, down!" Before he could react, something slammed into his back, sending him crashing to the ground. He could taste dirt in his mouth as he hit the ground hard, his rifle slipping from his hand. "Stay down," Thornton shouted, pulling Jensen into cover. He had tackled him just in time as a volley of bullets tore through the air where Jensen had been moments before. Jensen gasped, his heart racing. "Thanks. I almost—" "Don't talk," Thornton cut him off, his eyes scanning the area. "We're getting out now. Follow me." The two men crawled their way toward the breach Thornton had mentioned. As they moved, Jensen could hear the North Koreans shouting, their voices growing louder, closer. The mansion was surrounded, and the escape route they were counting on was quickly closing. Just as they reached the breach in the perimeter, Jensen heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps, heavy, methodical steps, marching in sync. North Korean soldiers. A whole line of them, marching toward the breach. "Damn it," Thornton cursed under his breath. "We're running out of options." Jensen looked up. The breach was their only chance. They had to make it through, no matter the cost. His hand gripped his rifle again, his fingers twitching, ready for what was coming next. But before he could act, something even more unsettling happened. The ground began to tremble beneath their feet. At first, it was subtle, just a faint vibration in the air. But then, it grew stronger, and a terrifying realization hit him. The mansion, the whole estate, was shaking. And it wasn't just the tanks. There was something bigger, something far more dangerous coming their way. Something that threatened to level the entire estate. The sound of an approaching helicopter filled the air, deafening and powerful. Jensen looked up, and his blood ran cold. The helicopter wasn't just any military craft. It was unmistakable, the North Korean presidential helicopter. It was descending rapidly toward the estate, and Jensen knew without a doubt that the situation was about to get far worse. Because Kim Jong-un was coming. And whatever plans the U.S. delegation had hoped for, whatever small chance they had of negotiating their way out of this mess, those chances were slipping away faster than they could run. Jensen's mind raced. They had to move. But as the helicopter descended, its rotor blades whipping up dust and debris, Jensen knew one thing for sure. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about the world watching and a power struggle that no one had been prepared for. And now, it was too late to stop it. The North Korean presidential helicopter hovered ominously above the estate, its engines roaring like thunder, a clear signal of authority and power. As the blades sliced through the air, the helicopter kicked up dust and debris, creating a near impenetrable fog around the perimeter. Jensen's heart thudded in his chest, the sight of the aircraft only adding to the sense of urgency and dread that had been building up since the first shots were fired. "Stay low," Thornton hissed, crouching beside him behind a thick stone column. "We've got seconds before the whole perimeter is compromised." Jensen nodded, his hand gripping his rifle so tightly his knuckles were white. His eyes darted back and forth, searching for any sign of movement. The North Korean forces were already swarming the outer edges of the estate, and their numbers had increased dramatically with the arrival of military reinforcements. Tanks lined the boundaries, and snipers were perched in the trees, ready to pick off anyone who dared make a move. The presidential helicopter descended further, its massive blades casting long shadows across the ground. It landed just outside the mansion's main entrance, and within seconds, the doors opened. Several black-suited bodyguards disembarked, forming a tight perimeter around the landing site. A moment later, a tall figure emerged from the helicopter, moving with the deliberate, almost regal posture of someone used to command. Kim Jong-un. Jensen's stomach twisted at the sight. The man who had been at the center of this entire diplomatic nightmare was finally here, and with him came the full weight of North Korea's military might. This was no longer a mere standoff, it was a full-scale power play, a move that would leave international relations in tatters. Jensen knew it was only a matter of time before Kim Jong-un would make his move to solidify his hold on the estate, and whatever negotiations had been planned were now completely irrelevant. "Do you think he knows we're still here?" Jensen whispered, his voice barely audible. Thornton's eyes were fixed on the scene unfolding in front of them, his expression grim. "He's here for a reason, and it's not to talk." The two men were still crouching behind the column, watching as Kim Jong-un moved toward the mansion's entrance. His bodyguards flanked him, their eyes scanning the area for any threats. Behind them, the North Korean soldiers continued to tighten their grip on the estate, securing every possible escape route. "We can't stay here much longer," Thornton said, his voice low but urgent. "If we're going to get out, we need to move now. I'll cover you." Jensen didn't hesitate. His training kicked in, and he quickly slid out from behind the column, moving low and fast. The helicopter was still whirring in the background, and the noise was enough to mask his movement as he crept toward the gap in the perimeter that Thornton had pointed out earlier. But as he neared the opening, the ground beneath him seemed to shake once more, stronger this time, as if the very earth was preparing for something catastrophic. A loud shout echoed through the air, and Jensen froze. His eyes snapped to the right, where a group of North Korean soldiers had emerged from behind a cluster of trees. They had spotted him. "Move!" Thornton shouted, firing off a quick shot in their direction to provide cover. The bullet hit one of the soldiers in the shoulder, sending him stumbling backward, but it wasn't enough to stop the others from closing in. Jensen didn't need to be told twice. He sprinted toward the breach in the perimeter, weaving between the scattered trees and rocks for cover. The sounds of gunfire rang out behind him as Thornton continued to provide cover, but Jensen could already hear the enemy closing in from every direction. They were being hunted, and the only way out was forward. The breach was only a few yards away, but the distance felt like miles. The soldiers were gaining on him, and with every step he took, the sound of boots on gravel grew louder. His lungs burned as he pushed himself harder, his eyes scanning the ground for any potential traps. Just as he reached the edge of the perimeter, a sharp pain erupted in his side. Jensen gasped, stumbling forward as he felt a searing pain spread across his ribs. He looked down, his vision blurring as he saw the blood seeping through his tactical vest. A bullet. He had been hit. "Jensen!" Thornton shouted, his voice strained as he sprinted toward him. But Jensen barely registered the sound. His body was screaming for him to stop, to collapse to the ground and give in to the pain. But he couldn't afford that. Not now. Jensen gritted his teeth and forced himself forward, his hand clutching his side to try and stem the bleeding. He had to make it to the gap in the perimeter. There was no other choice. With one last burst of energy, Jensen lunged through the breach, falling to the ground just as another round of gunfire exploded behind him. He rolled to his feet, ignoring the pain in his side, and looked back toward the mansion. Thornton had made it through too, but the soldiers were closing in fast. They couldn't afford to slow down. "We've got to keep moving," Jensen panted, trying to catch his breath. Thornton nodded, his face set in determination. "Head for the tree line. We can regroup there." The two men sprinted through the trees, the sound of gunfire fading as they put distance between themselves and the North Korean soldiers. But Jensen knew they weren't safe yet. The helicopter still hovered above, and Kim Jong-un was inside the mansion, no doubt preparing for his next move. Time was running out, and the walls were closing in. Inside the mansion, the situation had reached its boiling point. Kim Jong-un had entered the building with a sense of authority, flanked by his guards as he moved toward the main conference room. Blinken and the U.S. delegation were still holed up in their secure room, but the walls were closing in. The North Korean soldiers had surrounded the building, cutting off any possible escape routes. "We need to make a move now," Blinken said, his voice tight with anxiety. Before they breached the door, the entire team had gathered in the center of the room, their weapons drawn, ready to defend themselves if necessary. They knew they couldn't afford to wait much longer. Kim Jong-un's presence meant that any hope of negotiating their way out was gone. The only option left was survival. "I'll take point," one of the security officers said, moving toward the door. He peeked through the window, scanning the hallway for any signs of movement. The tension in the air was palpable, as though everyone in the room was waiting for the inevitable to happen. Suddenly, the door to the room was kicked open, and two North Korean soldiers barged in. The room erupted into chaos as the U.S. security team opened fire. Blinken ducked behind the nearest table, heart pounding in his chest. The soldiers returned fire, their movements fast and calculated, clearly trained for this kind of assault. For a moment, everything felt like a blur: gunshots, shouting, the acrid smell of smoke in the air, but through the chaos, Blinken's mind remained focused. He had to survive this. The team had to survive this. Then, in the midst of the confusion, a voice called out from the hallway, cutting through the noise like a blade. "It's too late to resist, Mr. Blinken." Blinken's blood ran cold. He recognized the voice immediately. Kim Jong-un. The North Korean leader's voice was calm, almost disinterested, as though the lives of the U.S. delegation meant little to him. "We've won," Kim Jong-un continued, his words carrying a chilling certainty. "Now, it's time to end this." Blinken's stomach dropped. It wasn't just a fight for survival anymore. It was a matter of control: who would walk away from this, and who would be left behind. Jensen, still reeling from his wound, pushed himself harder. Thornton had spotted the truck in the distance, but they weren't alone. North Korean soldiers were hot on their trail, and they had mere seconds before the perimeter was breached again. He took a deep breath, trying to ignore the pain in his side. They were almost there, but as they neared the truck, Jensen's radio crackled to life, and Thornton's voice came through, panicked and urgent. "Jensen, we've got a problem. It's not just the soldiers anymore. Kim Jong-un is inside. The entire mansion is being locked down." Jensen froze, his breath catching in his throat. Helicopter had already landed. Kim Jong-un had arrived. And now, the U.S. team was more than just caught in a firefight. They were trapped. The words locked down hit Jensen harder than the gunshot wound in his side. The realization of how deep they were in how utterly trapped sank in with brutal clarity. He and Thornton had been fighting for their lives, but now, with Kim Jong-un inside the mansion, the stakes had changed. The North Korean dictator's arrival wasn't just a strategic move, it was the final nail in the coffin for any hope of diplomatic resolution. Jensen's heart raced. The mansion was now a fortress. Kim Jong-un's presence meant they were no longer dealing with military forces. They were facing the full wrath of a totalitarian regime determined to make an example out of anyone who dared defy it. The streets outside were crawling with North Korean soldiers, and the U.S. delegation was still holed up inside, unaware that time was running out. The perimeter was tightening, and any last-minute escape was looking more and more impossible. Jensen glanced over at Thornton, his breath shallow from both pain and the fear gnawing at him. Thornton's expression was hard, calculating. The veteran agent had seen more than his fair share of combat, but even he knew they were in a position no one had expected. "Stay low," Thornton said, his voice steady despite the tension. "We get to the truck, we make our move, and we get the hell out of here. We don't have time to plan. We just move." "No hesitation." Jensen nodded, barely hearing the words. The world around him seemed to narrow into just one thing: survival. Every movement counted. Every second mattered. His wound was a dull, persistent throb in his side, but adrenaline kept him moving, kept him pushing forward. They had reached the truck and armored vehicle, their best chance for getting out of this alive. But before Jensen could even get a hand on the door, he heard it. The unmistakable sound of boots marching, heavier than before. The North Korean forces weren't just securing the mansion anymore, they were moving toward the exit points. They were tightening the net around the U.S. team and anyone else foolish enough to try and escape. "We need to go now," Jensen hissed through gritted teeth, his pulse racing. He grabbed Thornton's arm, yanking him toward the truck. "Now damn it!" The two agents scrambled into the armored vehicle, Jensen feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Thornton slammed the door shut, and in one fluid motion, he fired up the engine. The truck roared to life, its powerful engine drowning out the sound of distant gunfire. But they weren't out of the woods yet. As the truck lurched forward, Jensen peered through the bulletproof windows. Outside, the streets were alive with North Korean soldiers, their rifles raised as they moved in formation, preparing to secure the final exit points. Every avenue of escape was quickly becoming a dead end. But then, something caught Jensen's eye. A gap. Just ahead, a small alleyway between two buildings, barely wide enough for the truck to fit through. It was risky, but it was their best shot. "Take the left," Jensen shouted, his eyes locked on the alleyway. "If we cut through there, we might be able to get around the tanks." Thornton didn't hesitate. He whipped the steering wheel hard to the left, sending the truck barreling toward the narrow alley. The tires screeched against the gravel as the vehicle barely squeezed between the buildings, just inches from hitting the walls. The sound of gunfire erupted behind them as North Korean soldiers realized what was happening, but it was too late. The truck was already speeding down the alley, the tight confines making it impossible for the soldiers to follow without risking getting stuck. But Jensen knew it was only a temporary reprieve. They couldn't outrun this, not for long. Ahead, the alley opened up into a wider street, and for a brief moment, they had a clear shot at the main road. But just as they thought they might make it, the unmistakable sound of helicopters filled the air. Multiple choppers, coming in fast. Jensen's gut twisted. They weren't going to get far with air support on their tail. "Helos are on us," Thornton yelled. "Hold on tight." The truck's tires screamed as Thornton hit the accelerator, pushing the armored vehicle to its limits. The alley narrowed ahead, but Jensen could see the road now open, wide, and clear. But just as the truck shot out of the alley, the sound of helicopter blades grew deafening. Jensen's heart skipped a beat. The first helicopter opened fire. A barrage of bullets tore into the ground, sending debris and dirt flying. The vehicle rocked violently as one of the bullets slammed into the rear axle, causing a tire to explode with a deafening pop. "We're losing speed," Jensen shouted, panic creeping into his voice. "Not yet," Thornton gritted, slamming the gear shift into overdrive. The truck lurched forward, but with the back end dragging and one tire shredded, it was losing power fast. Thornton swerved to avoid a second hail of bullets from the hovering helicopters, but it was clear. They weren't going to outrun the incoming firepower. "Look for cover," Jensen shouted. Ahead, a row of parked cars offered a fleeting chance to hide. Thornton swung the truck hard to the right, crashing into the line of cars, using them as a shield from the relentless helicopter assault. The truck's engine sputtered and died, its power fading as it slammed into the side of a delivery van. Jensen's breath was ragged, the adrenaline and pain from his injury almost too much to bear, but he couldn't afford to collapse. Not now. Not when they were this close. Thornton jumped out of the truck first, his rifle at the ready, scanning the area. Jensen followed, pain lancing through his side with every step, but he forced himself to keep moving. They ducked behind a nearby dumpster, trying to make sense of their next move. The helicopters hovered above, their blades slicing through the air as the North Korean soldiers swarmed the streets. There was no way they were going to make it through the roadblocks. No way they were going to escape. And yet, somewhere deep inside, Jensen couldn't give up. Not now. Not with the world watching. Thornton's voice cut through the tension. "Jensen, we need to move to the extraction point. Now." Jensen nodded. The streets were becoming crowded with North Korean soldiers. Every exit was being locked down tighter than ever before. There was only one option left. If they could make it to the extraction point at the old dock, a chopper might still be able to get them out. "We have to go," Jensen said, his voice barely audible, a mixture of determination and raw fear. They were running out of time, running out of options. And then a voice rang out through the chaos. A voice Jensen knew all too well. "Stop! You're surrounded." Jensen froze, his blood running cold. There, standing on the far side of the street, surrounded by guards, was Kim Jong-un, and he was smiling. "Do you think you can escape this, Mr. Jensen?" Kim Jong-un called out, his tone calm, mocking. "You've lost. It's over." The world seemed to stand still for a moment. Jensen's heart pounded in his ears, his mind racing. But deep down, he knew one thing for sure. The fight wasn't over yet. And it wouldn't be until he was either free or bury in this nightmare forever. It was the final stand. The only question was, who would walk away from it alive? The street had become a battlefield. North Korean soldiers were scattered across the area, blocking every possible exit. The helicopters hovered overhead, their searchlights sweeping over the ground like predatory eyes, and Kim Jong-un stood at the center of it all, flanked by his bodyguards. His smile was cold, calculated, a man who had won, who knew his power and how easily he could crush anyone who dared oppose him. Jensen's breath was shallow. His side throbbed with pain, but it was drowned out by the thundering of his heart, the rapid rush of adrenaline coursing through his veins. He couldn't let this be the end. He wouldn't let it be the end. Thornton glanced at him, his expression grim. "We've got one shot," he said, his voice low, almost as though he were speaking more to himself than to Jensen. "We need to make it count." Jensen didn't need to ask what Thornton meant. There was only one way out now, the extraction point at the docks. They'd been trying to reach it for hours, but now that the perimeter was completely locked down, they would have to fight their way through. And if that wasn't enough, Kim Jong-un was standing directly in their path, orchestrating every move. His presence was a wall of authority, a reminder that the odds were no longer just against them, they were insurmountable. "Take the shot," Jensen muttered, his voice barely audible above the sound of the chopper blades. Thornton didn't answer immediately. His eyes were fixed on the leader of North Korea, watching his every movement as Kim Jong-un casually surveyed the chaos unfolding before him. Jensen knew Thornton was weighing the options in his mind, but there were no good choices left. Their options had been exhausted long ago. There was only the cold reality of survival. Then, without warning, Thornton made a decision. He moved quickly, pulling out a flashbang grenade from his vest. It was their best chance to break the tension, to create just enough chaos to slip through the cracks. "Cover your ears," Thornton ordered, and Jensen barely had time to react before Thornton tossed the grenade into the middle of the street. The explosion of light and sound was blinding. A flash so bright it seared the edges of Jensen's vision, followed by a deafening bang that rattled his bones. For a moment, the world went silent, broken only by the confusion of the soldiers as they tried to recover from the disorienting effect. That was their opening. Thornton pulled Jensen to his feet and they bolted for the docks. The pain in Jensen's side was unbearable, but he pushed it down, using what little strength he had left to stay on his feet. Gunfire erupted around them, but for the first time in hours, they were running towards something instead of away. They reached the narrow street leading to the docks, and just as they rounded the corner, the unmistakable sound of a helicopter's rotors broke through the air. A chopper American, this time, was hovering above the extraction point. The pilot had been tracking their movements, waiting for the right moment. "Get in," the voice from the helicopter shouted. Jensen and Thornton didn't need to be told twice. They ran toward the waiting craft, barely dodging another hail of gunfire as the North Korean forces tried to close in on them. The chopper's door opened, and the crewman inside reached out, pulling them up one by one. Jensen stumbled as he was hauled into the helicopter, the world spinning around him. The crewman shouted at him to hold on as the helicopter tilted sharply, its engines roaring as it lifted off the ground. The city below them shrank away as they climbed higher, away from the chaos, away from the men who had tried to make them prisoners. Jensen closed his eyes for a moment, letting the rush of relief wash over him. They had made it. Against all odds, they were free. But as they flew into the night sky, Jensen's mind drifted back to the man who had almost been their undoing. Kim Jong-un, the leader of North Korea. The man who had made his move, who had forced their hand. Kim had underestimated them, had assumed his power was absolute, but Jensen knew the truth. No one could hold on to that kind of power forever, especially not when the world was watching. Thornton leaned in, his face grim, but there was a flicker of something else, perhaps hope, perhaps resolve. "We survived, but this isn't over. They'll be coming for us again. They won't stop." Jensen nodded, his mind already racing with the thought of what was next. He knew Thornton was right. The North Koreans would regroup. There was no way they'd let this incident slide. But at that moment, Jensen allowed himself a brief moment of peace. For the first time in what felt like forever, he felt the crushing weight of the past few days lift from his shoulders, even if just for a few minutes. They had escaped the immediate danger. They were alive. And that had to count for something. As the helicopter soared toward the horizon, the lights of the city below fading into the distance, Jensen looked out over the dark ocean. His hand instinctively went to his side, where the bullet wound still ached. He could feel the weight of the world pressing down on him, but as the aircraft climbed higher, the pain seemed to lessen, replaced by a deep, almost primal sense of survival. They had made it. But the fight for peace, for freedom, was just beginning. And this time, they wouldn't be caught off guard. Kim Jong-un stood at the edge of the balcony in the mansion, watching the helicopter disappear into the night sky. His expression was unreadable, his thoughts shifting between anger and something darker, something that suggested this wasn't over, not by a long shot. The U.S. delegation had slipped away for now, but Kim knew they would return, and when they did, he would be ready. He would not let them escape again. And so, the game of power continued, with each side watching, waiting for the next move. But as the night stretched on, one thing was certain. This was far from the end. In the shadows of global politics, no one even truly wins. They just wait for their moment.